Welcome back to my knitwear channel. Today I have a very detailed tutorial for you how to create a summer crop top from scratch. Basically, I take you from the first cast on stitch to the last bind off stitch. We are going to go through all the stages of the project, and apart from that, I'm also going to share with you a process how I come up with the numbers for the stitches. So you can use this tutorial to create your crop top no matter what size or no matter what yarn you are using. In this project, you can easily modify the length of the piece. It does not have to be a crop top. So for this project, I presume that you already know how to knit and how to purl. The rest I'm going to show you. It is a very basic project, but I added some fun design details to make it interesting for you. As usual, for your convenience, I created a time code for this video so you can easily navigate it. As always, if by the end of this tutorial you still have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I also have a written pattern for this project. You can find a link to it in the description box below. So let's get to the tutorial. For this project, I'm going to use the yarn skeins from my stash, a blend of cotton with silk and Italian cotton. You can use any yarn that you have available. So we are going to work this project bottom up. This is the direction of the work. At the bottom, we're gonna start with the seed stitch. You can see on my swatch. This is the seed stitch for approximately 1.75 inches. The length can be different, it's up to you. Then we are going to switch to the contrasting yarn just for a couple of rows. This is just a design element that I'm using. And the rest of the project is going to be done in stockinette stitch. Actually, this side is the stockinette stitch. I'm choosing the reverse side of the stockinette stitch as my right side. Then we are going to go all the way up to the underarms. We are going to bind off a few stitches, go all the way up to the shoulders, bind off stitches for the neckline and leave live stitches for the shoulder to connect them later. So this piece is the back of the work, and now I'm going to show you how you can figure out for your size the number of stitches that you need to cast on. So first I'm going to show you how I calculated the numbers for my size, so you can use it as an example. So before we get to the stitches for the back, let's figure out the bust measurement. So my bust circumference is 34 inches. Please measure yours to be precise. But I don't want my top to be way too tight, so I want to add some extra space to this measurement. I'm going to add 3 inches. So to sum up, it will be 37 inches, the circumference of my top. But we need to get the measurement for the back. So the back is exactly the half of the bust measurement. So divided by 2, for me it will be 18.5 inches. So this is the number that I came up with. So the second important number that we will figure out is the gauge. What is the gauge? The gauge is basically the number of stitches in a certain number of inches. So let's see how many stitches I have in 1 inch, so I can calculate how many stitches I need for 18.5 inches. So for me, in 4 inches, I have 11 stitches. So to figure out how many stitches I have in 1 inch, I would basically divide 11 by 4, and it will give me 2.75 stitches. So I will use this number later to calculate how many stitches I need for the whole back. As of now, make sure to make a note what needle you're using. I personally got my gauge on 6mm needle or USA size 10. So I'm going to use those two numbers to calculate how many stitches I would need to cast on for the back. Now I'm going to explain you basically the logic behind all the numbers that I come up with, so you can use this example and create your own crop top with your own numbers if you're not using the pattern. So we already calculated how many inches I need for my back. To come to your own number, you would need to add 3 inches to your bust measurement. Measure the circumference of your bust, and you will get the total bust measurement for your crop top. And you will divide this number by 2 to get the inch measurement of your back piece. So let's check. If I use this formula, I will add to my 34-inch bust 3 inches. I will get 37 inches, which is bust total. And to get to the back measurement, I would divide this number by 2. And I get 18.5 inches. Your gauge might be different, so that's why I want to give you the formula so you can calculate the numbers for your gauge and you don't have to depend on my gauge in this example. So if you remember, my gauge per inch is 2.75 stitches. Yours you will calculate based on the swatch that you are going to knit. And now to come up with the number of cast on stitches, I will multiply 2.75 by my back measurement. So 18.5 multiplied by 2.75 will give me a number of 50.875. I obviously can't use any decimals, so I'm going to cast on let's say 50 stitches. I will probably add 2 extra stitches for the edge, but basically, yes, this is the formula. So you are going to multiply your gauge, which is in this example y number of stitches, by your back measurement, and using this formula you are going to come up with the number of stitches for your cast on. We are ready to cast on for our project. One little tip, I always use 2 needles for the initial cast on. The main needle and the needle that is at least 2 sizes smaller. It helps me to give this extra space to the cast on edge so it does not end up way too tight. I'm going to start with creating the loop so I can cast on the first stitch. As you can see, I'm using 2 strands of yarn. I often do that, just kind of taking any 2 skeins from my stash and knitting 2 strands together. I just like the texture effect it gives me, and it's also faster. So I'm started with the long tail cast on by inserting the index finger in between 2 threads of yarn. One is coming from the skeins I'm working from, and the other one from the long tail that I left for the cast on edge. So I'm going to cast on, if you remember, 50 stitches. I'm also going to add 2 extra stitches for the edge. You are going to cast on either the number of stitches that corresponds to your size in the pattern, if you downloaded the pattern, or if you did your own numbers, just use them. I've cast on 52 stitches. Now what I'm going to do is to take out the smaller needle that we used in the beginning. We won't need it anymore. You will notice how the cast on edge is moving freely along the needle. So now we are going to start with the first row. I'm going to knit the first stitch. We will always knit the first and the last stitch in this pattern. And the first rows we are going to work in 6 stitch pattern. So I'm going to purl knit until the end of the row, until the last stitch of the row. As you can see, I'm using the continental method of knitting. I'm not a thrower, but it doesn't matter. You work in any method that is more convenient for you. So the last stitch we are going to knit always. This is the first row. We are going to flip the work to the wrong side and continue in 6 stitch pattern. The first stitch we are always going to knit, and according to the pattern, now we are going to do knit, purl, and so on until the last stitch of the row. So one little tip: in seed stitch pattern, whenever you see the purl stitch, you will knit it, and whenever you see the knit stitch, you will purl it. You're gonna finish the wrong side row all the way to the last stitch. The last stitch we are always going to knit, and you're basically going to continue in this manner until the desired height of the seed stitch part. So in my sample, the seed stitch part is around 1.75 2 inches. The exact number does not really matter as long as you like how it looks like, so you can be creative. So we are done with the seed stitch part in main color. It is up to you if you want to add the contrasting color or not. I thought that it would be fun to kind of break down the piece with a couple of rows of contrasting yarn knitting. But of course, it is entirely up to you. I'm connecting the yarn, I'm joining the yarn from the right side of the project. So I'm going to continue with the stitch pattern for 2 rows. Remember to always knit the last and the first stitch. The first row is done, and now we are going to flip it to the wrong side and continue stitch pattern on the wrong side. So we will knit the first stitch. We can see that the next stitch is knit, so we're gonna purl it, purl, knit, purl, knit, and so on until the end of the row. Knit the last stitch. We are done with the 2 rows knitting the contrasting yarn. Again, it is all up to you if you would like to get creative and knit more rows in contrasting yarn. Please feel free to experiment. Or maybe you would like to completely switch to a different yarn color. Also, don't feel like you have to follow this tutorial step by step. You can definitely be creative and you can make your own pattern just using the steps that I'm sharing with you. So we are switching back to the main yarn, and we are going to knit the first row. In my case, as I'm using the reverse stockinette stitch as the right side, this is the wrong side for me. The knit side is the wrong side for me. You can see how the contrasting yarn accentuated the texture created by the seed stitch. You can see those bumps. Now the right side of the project for me, we are going to knit the first stitch as usual, and I'm going to purl all the stitches. Again, I'm using the continental method. You can use any method of knitting that you prefer. And we always knit the last and the first stitch of the row on every single side. And we are going to continue working in this manner back and forth. Knit on the wrong side, purl on the right side. I'm using the reverse stockinette stitch as the right side of my fabric. Again, it is very easy to modify the length. So for me, this piece is enough. It's about 8.5 inches, and you can keep knitting until the desired length of the piece. Now we are going to bind off the stitches to remove some extra fabric from underarm. According to my calculations, 4 stitches on each side is what I need to bind off. You can calculate your number of stitches to bind off depending on your preferences. In my experience, usually 1.5 to 2.5 inches is enough. Continue working until the end of the row. As usual, knit the last stitch. So this is how your work looks like at this point. You can see you have bound off stitches on one end, and now we are going to match it on the opposite side. Turn your work to the wrong side and bind off the exact same number of stitches. In my case, it's 4. 1, 2, 3, and the last one. And now I'm going to continue working pattern, in this case knitting all the stitches until the end. And right now we are going to knit the last stitch of the row as usual. This is how your work looks like at this point. We are going to continue working in simple stockinette stitch pattern. We will go all the way up until the desired length. Again, you can be creative and you can modify the length of the armhole. For me, usually 6.5, 7 inches for the top is enough. Okay, next step are shoulders and the neckline. So according to my calculations, I would need 8 stitches per each shoulder to get the shoulder width that I want. Again, you can be creative and use your gauge to calculate how many stitches you would need in each shoulder. Or you can use the downloadable pattern and check what I recommend for your size. So according to my calculations for my size and preferences, I would need 8 stitches per each shoulder. So as you can see, I worked on 8 stitches, and now I'm going to bind off 36 stitches until I come to the last 8 stitches. So I have the same number of stitches in each shoulder. If you need a simple point of reference, my shoulder is around 2 inches, maybe 1.75 inches, something like that. For me, it's enough. So I came to the last 8 stitches of the row. I'm going to work them as usual. Make sure that you still knitting the last stitch of each row. And I'm basically done with the back. So this is how my work looks like at this point. 2 shoulders, the neckline, and the armholes. I'm going to cut off the yarn of each shoulder, leaving a long tail. And I'm going to place the live stitches on a holder, just like that. We are going to use them later. Make sure that you get every single stitch and you don't lose any. Take out the needle and secure the live stitches. We are going to do the same on the opposite shoulder. Just a little tip, try to use the contrasting yarn, so for you it's easier to identify which stitches belong to the project and where is the scrap yarn. Visually it is just much easier. And we are done with the back part. This is how your work looks like. The right side and the wrong side for me. And now we are going to make the identical piece for the front. So we are making the front identical to the back up to the underarm. The armhole length we are going to need a little bit shorter, just because we would need some extra rows to shape the shoulders and the neckline. So I'm going to start working on 10 stitches for the shoulder, just because I need 2 extra stitches for the neckline shaping. I worked 10 stitches for the shoulder. Now I'm going to bind off 32 stitches and work on the last 10 stitches. So overall it's going to be 52 stitches. If you're following the pattern, you will see all the numbers for your size. Or if you're working with your own numbers, just increase the number of stitches for the shoulder by 2 stitches compared to the back. Okay, I'm done with this part. The last stitch I'm going to knit as usual. This is how my work looks like at this point, and now I'm going to work each shoulder separately. Right shoulder. Right now I'm just going to knit across all 10 stitches. No shaping at this point. All the way to the end. And now I'm going to continue working on the same stitches for the right shoulder, and I'm going to start shaping the neckline. I'm going to slip the first stitch without working it, just like that, with the yarn in the back, and those 2 stitches I'm going to purl together. So I'm going to decrease basically 1 stitch, just like that. And now the next step is to pass the first stitch, the one that you slipped of the needle, over the worked stitch, just like that. So this way we are going to decrease 2 stitches, come to the number 8, which is the same for the back, and create this slight slope that runs from the shoulder towards the neckline. So I'm going to finish working on these stitches, purling all the stitches to the last one. The last one we knit as usual. And just like for the back, I'm going to put the live stitches on a contrasting yarn and tie them up so we don't lose them. We're going to use them later. And now we are going to come back to the opposite shoulder. I'm going to flip the work to the wrong side and attach, rejoin the yarn to the first stitch from the wrong side, just like that. Now I'm going to work on these stitches. I'm going to knit all 10 stitches across until the end of the row without making any modifications. And I'm going to flip the work to the right side. The purl side is facing me. And I'm going to knit the first stitch as usual and purl all the way to the last 3 stitches of the shoulder. And what I'm going to do right now is to decrease 2 stitches by inserting the needle inside of the 3 stitches and purling them. So purl 3 together, and you can see we created a neckline slope. I'm going to cut off the yarn as usual and put the live stitches on a holder. So I'm done with the front. You can see a slight slope created for the neckline, just to open it up a little bit. Now I have 2 pieces done, and our next step would be to put them together. The right side of the fabric, I remind you, for me, is the reverse stockinette stitch, the purl side. I'm going to place the back piece on the top of the front. So what we would have to do is to seam the sides, obviously, and the shoulders. For the shoulders, I'm going to use the 3 bind off method. It's my favorite way to connect the shoulders, but also in this case, it will add a decorative design element to the piece. So the first step is to move the live stitches to the spare needle. So I'm going to use the straight needle, the similar size I have for working the main fabric, and I'm going to use the working needle to connect the pieces. In order to connect 2 shoulders, I'm going to insert the working needle into 2 stitches at the same time, the back shoulder stitch and the front shoulder stitch. And I'm going to use the contrasting yarn again for the decorative purposes. You can use the main yarn, it's really up to you. So we are going to again insert the working needle into both stitches on the first needle and on the second one and knit them together at the same time, slipping them off the spare needles. And now we are going to pass the first worked stitch over the last one and kind of close it up, creating this chain that will run along the shoulder seam. And we are going to continue in this manner until we bind off all the stitches. As you can see, this braid is being created that will run along the shoulder seam. Again, you can use the main yarn if you don't want it to be visible, but I wanted to add this design element, this splash of color to the pretty neutral piece. We are coming to the last two shoulder stitches, slipping it off the spare needles and closing the last stitch and closing the chain basically. Let's cut off the contrasting yarn, and you will see how the ridge is being created on the shoulder seam. This little decorative element. This is how it looks like on the wrong side, the right side. Now let's get to the opposite shoulder. The back is facing us. If you notice, this time I'm working from the neckline edge towards the armhole edge. Because of the nature of the 3 bind off stitch, the chain that we are creating, I have to change the direction, because if I do it from the opposite side, the ridge that we created on the right shoulder will be flipped to the other side on the left shoulder, if it makes sense. So we have to move right now from the neckline to the armhole edge. So we are working identically to the other shoulder, closing up the chain, and this is how our work looks like at this point, the back of the work and the front of the work. Next step is to seam the pieces together. Right now the front is facing you. The front is on top of the back piece, and we are going to use the crochet hook to create a chain running along this ridge. That's why we were knitting every single first and last stitch of the row to create these bumps. These bumps actually help us to identify where to insert the crochet hook, and also they make a great decorative creative element in the final piece. And as you can see, we are going to insert the hook under the edge of the front and of the back piece, pull the yarn through and create the crochet stitch chain. So pull the second loop. You will always have to have 2 loops on your hook, and then pull the last worked stitch through the first worked stitch, creating a chain. I'm using the contrasting yarn just because I want to add this element to the final piece, create this contrasting line running along the sides, and also it helps me to show you what I'm actually doing here. If you feel like creating an invisible seam, just use the main yarn and do the same thing, but from the wrong side of the fabric, so this ridge is concealed. But I personally like this little element to a pretty simple piece. So this is how your work looks like at this point. This is on the back and this is the front. So we are just going to continue all the way to the armhole, just like that. You can see how this beautiful line is being created. I'm going to cut off the yarn and check how the work looks like at this point. So you can see the ridge created, the line running on the back of the work, on the front of the work. So next step, we are going to flip the piece, and still the front is facing us. So to create the same looking line, this time we have to go from the armhole bind of edge towards the cast on edge. This way we are going to create the identical look into the opposite side crochet stitch chain. So just like on the opposite side, we are going to insert the hook right under the edge of the front and the back piece, pull through the yarn and close the crochet stitch chain. So we are going to work all the way towards the cast on edge. You can see how the chain is being formed. So this is the last stitch that we are going to connect. Also, if you feel like creating a split, don't work all the way to the end. Stop a little bit higher and you will have a little side split, but it's again up to you. Let's cut the contrasting yarn. We are done with this part. The piece is all put together. You can see how it looks like on both sides. All these little design details were basically created by the finishing techniques. So as you can see, the finishing technique can be both practical and creative at the same time. So now let's flip the work to the wrong side and start weaving in the ends. So all the ends are hidden. This is how your work looks like at this point. I still have one last end left on the neckline, but because I'm going to trim the neckline right now, I'm going to hide it along the way. Let's see how it's done. I'm going to create a simple single crochet chain around the neckline just to give it a little bit more structure. A simple single crochet stitch, insert the hook into the edge, pull the yarn through. You have 2 loops and then pull the working yarn through 2 loops. Also, you can see how I'm kind of running the loose end along the edge. So that's a huge time saver. You're basically trimming the neckline and at the same time hiding one of the ends. So I'm finishing the neckline. Let's cut the yarn, hide this last end in the neckline ridge, and basically we are done with most of the work. And that's it. We are done with our summer top project. I'm super excited about it. I hope I'll wear it a lot this summer. And I also hope to see a lot of variations on your needles. I remind you that you can find the written pattern for this project on my website, the link in the description box below. If you still have any questions about any part of this tutorial, please leave them in the comment section below. I hope you found this tutorial helpful. Please subscribe and I'll see you next week.